Welcome back, my fellow peanuts. Today I'm going to be announcing the winner of the competition for YouTube, and that happens to be Claire Rapp. She answered correctly. So your prize is going to be a singlet with your favourite logo on it. In the comments below, if you can please tell me what your favourite logo is, and I will get that ordered. Now, this podcast covers true crime cases that may not be suitable for young listeners, and there may be graphic and violent content. Listener discretion is advised. Now, on today's podcast, we're going to be talking about the Gainesville Ripper, otherwise known as Danny Rowling. He was also the killer that inspired the movie Scream, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Now, Danny would kill 8 people, with his first murders starting in Louisiana, but his killing spree would actually end in Florida. So this week's episode is going to be about Florida. Now, I'm no longer going to be doing a part 1 and a part 2. We're going to combine them into one, and we're going to make it easier for the listeners and the viewers. Now, Danny Rowling was born on May 26, 1954 in Shreveport, Louisiana, to a James and Claudia Rowling. Now, James was a horrifically abusive father. He beat Danny and his younger brother and also his mum. Now, he was a police officer, which I really actually think it makes it worse, as we tend to hold them in a high regard. Now, Danny would actually say in his own words that he was a cold-hearted son of a bitch. Now, he would constantly seek attention, good or bad, from his father, because even though his father was abusive, he still viewed his dad as his hero, which I can sort of imagine, being that his dad was a police officer, he was well regarded in the community, he definitely had a certain panache, I guess we could call it, in regards to being a police officer. So I can understand why Danny would hold him in such a regard. Now, his father would do something so awful while Danny was still quite young and at school. I'm just going to allude to it and not give in too many details, because when Danny got home from school, he'd ask where his puppy was, and all his dad would show him was a grave and tell him what happened to the dog. Now, imagine being such an awful human and father that you do this to your own child. He wanted to take away anything from Danny that made him happy. He was just a really, really appalling human being. Like, I can't even imagine doing that to a child. Now, I think the reason behind it is because James had actually said he never wanted children. And when Danny was barely even 1, he was beaten so severely for not even crawling properly. Now, how can you control that at the age of 1? How can you honestly control what you're doing? Like, again, guys, just another horrific childhood. When Danny's younger brother was born, though, the abuse would get even worse. I'm guessing it's because there was an added child now, and he would just suffer more and more abuse throughout his childhood. And his school counselors would actually comment that Danny suffered from an inferior complex with aggressive tendencies and poor impulse control. Now, these traits would certainly foreshadow what was going to come later on in his life. Now, throughout his childhood, his mum would try and leave, but as with most of domestic violence relationships, she would inevitably come back. And at around the age of 9, he would say that home was just not a safe place. And nighttime and being out was where he would feel at ease, and he would begin to start roaming the streets. Now, this is sort of where the peeping Tom behaviour would start, but it'd be really, really quite innocent at the beginning. So he would look into the homes with what he would describe as normal families. Now, he would fantasize and just long to be a part of that. So that's what he would do initially when he would go out and sort of find some normal behaviour. Now, he'd come upon a lady later who had just come out of the shower, and this is where he would start to find sexual gratification in watching and leering at her. Now, this moment would become significant, as I think this is the moment where he initially started becoming a sexual predator. Now, the reason that I say this is actually how many serial rapists start out. They start out by being peeping Toms. They start out by watching people, sexually being satisfied by watching these people. So this is sort of where that sexual predator behavior begins. Now, at around the age of 14, he would be caught looking at a neighbor's daughter's room. Now, his father would also beat him as a form of punishment. Sort of, can you see where that's coming from now, guys? So, to escape this abuse, Danny would start drinking and using drugs. Now, this is what normal behavior does tend to happen with children who are suffering at the hands of their parents. Any escape to make it easier to deal with the pain. Like, it's just a really normal reaction. Now, next in his life, he would actually try and enlist in the Navy. However, they wouldn't take him. So he would end up joining the Army instead. This wouldn't last very long, though, as his drug use only increased during this time. He would actually say that during his time in the Army that he dropped acid over 100 times. It did really seem like the military was not giving him the stability and the comfort that he was really desperately seeking. Now, once he left the military, he'd actually find it really hard to maintain a job. However, once he married in 1974, friends would actually say that this was one of the happiest times of his life, especially when his daughter was born. Now, he even managed to hold down a job during this time. Now, unfortunately, it didn't seem to be able to last, as during about the second year of marriage, the cracks were already starting to show. Now, he'd become controlling, verbally abusive with his wife. He was actually beginning to behave a lot like his father. So after a particularly horrible fight, when he threatened to kill his wife, she'd actually leave him after 3 years and take their daughter with her. Now, he became enraged at the thought of this. Now, this again is just my opinion, but I think Danny was trying desperately to seek control, as he'd never had any real control when he was a child. And I think this is where the hatred for women would really start to spiral out of control. Now, he already had a pretty poor opinion on women, as his mother had been unable to protect him from his father. So we're going to hear a little bit more about that with the victims too, like in regards to his mum and how he would take it out on her. So rather than coming to terms and dealing with this loss, it just seemed to fill him with even more rage and hostility. Now, in about 1977, he would rape a woman that looked very similar to his ex-wife, and he'd even be involved in a car accident in which a woman would die. So you can sort of see all of these signs are leading up to him becoming a serial killer. There's just so much here already that you can see. Now, at 6'2", he was really strong and powerful and an overwhelming presence to most people. Now, he would definitely use this size and this strength during his 8 murders. So during the 1970s and the late 1980s, he'd committed a number of crimes such as sexual assault, petty crimes, and theft with a series of armed bank robberies that had actually landed him in jail in Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama. Now, he'd also managed to break out of prison during these times, but he would be paroled in 1988. Before Danny would become the infamous Gainesville Ripper, he would murder 3 people in his hometown of Shreveport in November 1989. The victims would be Sean Grissom, who was 8, Julie Grissom, 24, and Julie's father and Sean's grandfather, who happened to be 55. It's a really horrific murder, and it would really give him the first taste of it, right? He was well on his way after this murder to becoming a sexually sadistic killer. Now, William Tom Grissom, he preferred to be called Tom, he would be described as polite, friendly, respectable, and just in general a really lovely person. And he'd actually recently been doing a lot better after battling throat cancer. Now, Julie was Tom's daughter. She just transferred recently to the Shreveport campus of LSU. She had a part-time at Dillard's, and she was just about to graduate. Now, Sean was in the 3rd grade, and he was visiting his grandfather and aunt for part of his birthday weekend. Now, Danny would actually see Julie at her part-time job, and he'd take a bit of a liking to her. So he would try and talk to her, but he felt like she had rejected him. Now, according to reports, Julie never actually interacted with him, and what's suspected is this was all playing out in Danny's mind, not necessarily how it all went down. So he would follow her home, and their home backed onto the woods, so it was really easy for him to peep on her and watch the family. Now, while Tom was cooking dinner on the barbecue, The door to the sliding door to the house would be unlocked as he was stepping in and out, but when he would be stepping in, he would lock it. Now, Danny was originally coming to the house to rape Julie for spurning his advances. Again, I think he made up this scenario in his head. This murder, even though it was his first, it was really well organised. He wore a mask, he had his knife ready, and he would end up walking up to Tom while he was in the laundry and he'd stab him in the back. Now, he would see Julie, and she had just witnessed this, and she just imagine the terrified. Like, just imagine being that terrified. He would tell her to go back to the bedroom and wait, and she actually did. He would then murder Sean while he was watching TV. Now, Danny would tell his psychologist, Dr. Harry Krupp, when he asked why he killed the father and Sean, and his response was, it's a little beyond disturbing, because they were in the way. That's actually what he said. I can't even comprehend. So once Tom and Sean had been murdered, he would go back to the bedroom where Julie was. He would rip her clothes off and her underwear with a knife, where he would then rape her. He would feel gratification at the fear he was instilling upon Julie. Now, after he'd finished traumatizing Julie, he would actually roll her on her back and stab her to death. But after her death, he would end up posing her. She'd be posed with her legs spread, partially hanging off the bed, and vinegar would actually be used as part of the cleanup to prevent Danny from being identified as a killer and the rapist. On Monday morning, it was actually noticed by the neighbours that the newspapers were still out, the cars hadn't moved. Now, it should also be noted that Sean's mother had rung the police after she'd made several phone calls to the house and there was no answer, and Sean also wasn't at school that Monday morning. Now, police rang the neighbours and would ask if the house was unlocked. This was a small and a quiet and a safe place in Shreveport. So Bob Coyle, he's a neighbour, he went to check on the family. He saw the body, Tom's body in particular, but he didn't go inside the house because he just feared what he was going to see next. Now, his body was slumped against the laundry door and it blocked the entrance. So he ended up having several stab wounds in the back and the chest. Sean would be found in the living room, and Julie's body would be found next. The police were really appalled at what they saw, and they were just absolutely desperate to find this killer. The police would be searching for a psychologically disturbed man that was familiar with police procedures. The neighbourhood would be terrified that there was a psycho on the loose and he was going to break in and kill them all. And you can just imagine the fear that he was instilling upon this small town. It was a really safe neighbourhood. They hadn't experienced a murder, I think it was in like 10 years. So it put a lot of fear in the community. Now, not too far away from the Grissom home, Danny Rowling was actually living with his parents, and he'd been living with them ever since he'd been paroled. And to say that house was tense was an absolute understatement. Almost 6 months after the Grissom murders, probably around May 1990, he'd actually shoot his father after a fight. Now, this was sort of like all bottled up and coming together, right? You can just imagine you're living with your parents after you've been paroled. Danny's already got a really contentious relationship. It was really, really difficult. And he would end up, his father would survive, but he'd lose an eye and an ear. Now, Danny would actually flee the area, but not before stealing someone's identity, Michael Kennedy Jr. He'd take a bus to Sarasota, Florida, to begin his new life. Now, this is where the infamous Gainesville murders would begin. The Gainesville Ripper would be born after 5 students were murdered, and he ended up also at the same time going on a burglary and a robbery spree. Now, this would all begin around August 1990. And this is where Danny would end up creating hysteria in a small university town of Gainesville. Now, I'm not sure if everybody is familiar, but Gainesville Gators are absolutely a fantastic football team. It's where Aaron Hernandez, I think it was, the infamous killer, he went to school. So everyone knows who the Gainesville Gators are. Now, when Danny first arrived, he stayed at a local motel, but he'd actually end up moving to the woods to avoid police detection. Now, this was not only just because of the murders, but also because of the bank robberies that he was doing. Now, on Friday, the 24th of August, 1990, he would break into 18-year-old Sonia Larson and 17-year-old Christina Powell's apartment. Now, this would be the girls' first year of college at the University of Florida. Both girls were just enjoying the experience of living off campus and being away from their parents. Now, Christina's been described as the life of the party. She's outgoing. She's a really wonderful person. Sonia was a little bit more quiet. She was shy, studious, and hardworking. Now, when he broke in, he would actually find Christina sleeping downstairs, but he would leave her alone for the moment. Now, he'd go upstairs first, and he would find Sonia asleep in her bedroom. He would tape her mouth so that she couldn't scream, and he would rape and stab her multiple times before going downstairs to murder Christina. Now, he'd also tape her mouth, but he'd bind her hands behind her back. He would force her to perform oral sex, and he'd threaten her with the knife, and he'd cut her clothes off with that knife. He'd then rape her, but after he had finished raping her, he would order her to roll over onto her stomach and would stab her in the back multiple times. Now, he would actually go back to Sonia and mutilate her body even further and pose her in a sexually provocative position. And he'd end up doing the same to Christina. But before leaving their apartment, he would actually end up taking a shower. Now, I imagine this was to make sure he didn't leave any more evidence. And also, if he was found or if someone saw him, he needed to look like he hadn't just killed two innocent girls, right? So on Sunday, the 26th of August, Christina's parents, Frank and Patricia Powell, they'd grown concerned when their daughter hadn't been heard from, so they ended up calling building management to assist, as no one had actually heard from her or Sonia since the Friday, and Christina was aware that her parents were coming up. So they found it strange that when they arrived, that music was blaring from the apartment and no one was answering the door. Now, a police officer by the name of Ray Barber had been actually called to the apartments due to the noise complaint, and that building management maintenance person, he didn't want to enter the apartment without the police. So Ray and the maintenance guy, they'd attempt to use the master key. However, this actually wouldn't work on the apartment, so they would need to break into the apartment to find the girls. The most horrible part for me, I imagine, is the parents were there to witness the maintenance man throw up as a result of what he'd actually seen. I can't even imagine being those parents and witnessing that for myself. So I just feel for them. But perhaps one of the luckiest people on earth was the other roommate who happened to not be home over this particular weekend. Now, she had to be told by the police when she arrived on scene. She would have been so relieved and saddened at the same time. Like, I can't even imagine, like, survivor's guilt. Now, the police would begin the investigation at the Williamsburg Village apartments, which you can see from the photo that I'm showing, are relatively close to one another. Now, my question is, how did you not hear what was going on? But if you are an apartment complex that currently holds, like, other college students, I imagine they just didn't think much of it. Now, from what I've read about the investigation, though, the neighbours presumed that the girls were actually unpacking. They were hanging pictures and playing music too loudly, because they did hear some banging, but that was where they made the presumption about hanging pictures. But it would be an easy assumption to make when three girls are moving into an apartment that they're going to play a little bit music too loud, they're going to be a little bit noisy. But the police would continue investigating throughout the night. They'd question more neighbours, they'd check for more evidence, such as fingerprints, but they would find some semen on a small paper towel in the kitchen. Behind the apartment in the woods, they'd also find some further evidence. Now, just as they were finishing up at this particular scene, they'd be called out to another grisly scene. Now, 18-year-old Krista Hoyt, she worked as a records clerk in the county sheriff's office, and she also attended the Santa Fe Community College. Now, the day before, on August 25th, Danny broke into her apartment through a sliding door and using a screwdriver and parts of the knife. Now, she wouldn't be home, so he waited in her living room. She unfortunately would return around 11 a.m. He'd sneak up behind her and put her in a chokehold. Now, he would tape her mouth and bind her wrists like he did with Christina. Now, he would drag her to the bedroom where he would also cut all of her clothes off, and he would also rape her. Again, similar to what he did with Christina, he would force Krista down, face down, and he'd stab her to death. He would be even more violent and mutilate her even more so than Christina and Sonia. Now, he would leave initially, but realised once he got back to his campsite, you can see the picture of his little campsite just there, that he didn't have his wallet. Now, he feared that he'd actually left it at her apartment, so he ended up going back. And he would decide to add further insult to injury. He'd end up decapitating her. Now, he'd pose her body at the end of her bed with her legs spread and then place her head on a bookshelf so that that head looked directly at her body. And during his confession, Danny would admit that the reason he left the bodies like that was on purpose. He wanted to horrify and shock anyone that saw them. Truly, truly a sick individual. Now, Gail Barber, who just happened to be the wife of Ray Barber, who just discovered the girls Christina and Sonia, and her partner, Keith O'Hara, they were called out to Krista's apartment after she'd failed to turn up to a midnight shift at the sheriff's office. And when they couldn't get in the front door, they'd walk round to the side and see a sliding door. Now, the blinds didn't quite reach the ground, so they were able to peer underneath, and all they could see was a body with no head. Seriously, though, what are the chances that a husband and a wife would be the ones to find the first three victims, right? Now, once the police department realised that all three murders were linked, a task force was actually set in motion to get this killer. Now, it would comprise of top crime scene techs, investigators, reps from the Florida Highway Patrol and the Department of Law Enforcement, as well as behavioural specialists, in particular from the FBI, to gain a profile and to see whether they could actually, find this person a lot quicker. Now, at around 3 a.m. on August 27th, Danny would once again break into an apartment by prying open a sliding glass door with a screwdriver. This time, it would have two flatmates, one male by the name of Manuel Taboda, he liked to be called Manny, and one female by the name of Tracy Pauls. They were both aged 23, and they would be students as well at the University of Florida. He would kill Manny first, and Manny would put up a big fight for his life. And judging from the defensive wounds on his body, he put up a really, really good fight. But unfortunately, he would be overpowered and also lose his life. Now, Tracy would hear the struggle from Manny's room, and she ran back to her bedroom to try and lock the door, but Danny was just so much faster. Now, she would be put through what the other female victims had been put through, and he would once again pose her body for shock value and dragging her body off the bed and near the doorway where he would end up putting her on display. He would also shower at their apartment, and a maintenance man would once again discover the bodies after friends had become concerned when they couldn't contact Manny or Tracy. Now, this would be where the police would ruin a man's life by the name of Edward Humphrey. Now, an officer would tell her superiors of a number of weird occurrences involving Edward. He was just a weird kid. He said weird things. He just didn't act normal, right? He would be arrested for disorderly conduct, and he did have some peculiar behaviour, and he was known to be violent. Like when someone asked him about the murders, he actually giggled, so he wasn't putting up the best front, right? Like people didn't know really how to take his behaviour. Now, Edward would end up having an altercation with his grandmother where he would hit her, and he'd be arrested and he'd be held on $1 million bail, as he was their number one suspect. And being that the murders had stopped shortly after he was arrested, sorry, the murders had stopped before he was arrested, but no other murders occurred. So it's an easy assumption to make. Now, he'd end up being sentenced to 22 months in a state hospital for those assault charges, even though his grandmother had dropped those charges. And whilst his name was never officially cleared, even after Danny's arrest and conviction, and he didn't receive any type of apology from the police department for what he'd done to him and his family. Now, Danny would actually later graduate with honours and speak during a documentary. Now, he said at the time of his arrest and being a suspect, he was actually suffering from bipolar and he wasn't on his medication. So I can see where they made like an easy fly to go towards the not so normal person, but still his blood type didn't even match. Like, it wasn't great. Now, during the investigation, semen's recovered from each of the 3 murder sites. Now, DNA at this stage was still in its infancy, but it was determined that the suspect was a secretor, and they were able to determine that the blood type was B. Now, while the police were focused so heavily on Edward Humphrey, the real killer was still out there. He was robbing banks, amongst other things. Now, the police would pursue this bank robber, and they'd actually come upon a campsite where they'd find a screwdriver that matched the description of the one that had broken into the apartments. Now, this particular screwdriver was examined by technicians and they'd cleared it, saying it wasn't the correct screwdriver because they'd identified it to a particular brand. They would be so very wrong. Now, they would end up finding money from a robbery with the dye pack and various other items. These will come up again, those various items. Now, Danny would need to get out of the area quick smart. Now, he'd resorted back to his known ways to be a criminal, robbing and stealing. Now, this would actually prove to be his undoing, as he'd be arrested in Ocola after a robbery gone wrong in at the Winn-Dixie. Miss Winn-Dixies. The task force were not able to link Edward to the murders, so they actually ended up deciding to see if there were any similar cases in VICAP, which is the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. Now, this is a tool that police and FBI use. It's the largest investigative repository of major violent crime cases in the US. Now, it's designed to collect and analyse any information about homicides, sexual assaults, missing persons, and other violent crimes involving unidentified human remains. Now, the results would come up with one that the task force just couldn't ignore: the Grissom family murders in Shreveport. Now, the similarities between the murders was just really hard to ignore. Now, both the killers, they shared a knowledge of police procedures, things like cleaning up a crime scene, removing tape that he'd used on his victim, the same point of forced entry into the house, the use of a knife, cutting the clothes off the women, the mutilation of the bodies, and in particular, the posing of the women. So shortly after discovering the links, they found that Julie Grissom had had a bite mark on her. Now, saliva had been collected and they had to run some further tests, but they found that the blood types matched, so they were both blood type B. The final straw would actually come from a tip by a woman by the name of Cindy. Now, she knew Danny personally, and she would call Crime Stoppers and tell them to investigate him. He'd once remarked to Cindy and her husband something along the lines of, "I like to stab people." Now, she'd been watching the murders in Florida, and she knew of the Grissom family murders, and she just couldn't shake the feeling that Danny had been involved in this particular occurrences. Now, the task force would actually begin to look a lot closer at Danny Rowling as a result. Now, they'd look at the crimes around the times of the murders, those pesky bank robberies, the pesky bank robberies, and they'd actually remember about the campsite where they'd found things in relation to those bank robberies. Now, those items in particular would include bedding, a gun, a ski mask, a cassette tape, and a screwdriver. Now, lab tests would obviously begin on all of those items. Now, it was found that, in fact, that screwdriver did match the prime marks. Now, a pubic hair belonging to Krista Hoyt would be identified through DNA, and the next step would be to get the DNA from Danny. to match and just see if it did actually match those murder scenes. Now, with all of this going on, they also knew that Danny was in a cola on the robbery charges from the Winn-Dixie. So they would actually go to his cell and they'd get anything they could to try and match it. However, the prosecutor, he didn't want Danny getting off on a technicality. So he actually insisted they get a warrant before anything else was run. Now, as you can only imagine, the test results came in and they did in fact belong to Danny Rowling. Now, he would be charged and indicted in November 1991 on five counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of sexual battery, and 3 counts of armed robbery. He'd also be facing the death penalty due to the first-degree murder charges. Now, before he came to trial for those murders, he would actually end up being convicted on federal robbery charges, and he'd be sent to a federal prison where he'd meet an inmate by the name of Bobby Lewis. Now, Bobby would actually claim to investigators that Danny had confessed to all 5 murders in Gainesville and he wanted to talk to them. And Danny and Bobby would end up meeting with these investigators, but he wouldn't talk directly to them. He would use Bobby as his mouthpiece. So he would whisper things to Bobby and Bobby would, speak about it to the investigators. Now, he would confess over a period of 3 hours, but the officers were able to get Danny to at least nod and say yes things to confirm that he did actually, in fact, commit them. But he would claim that a demon had possessed him by the name of Gemini. The detectives didn't believe that for a second, and they ended up thinking it was just another ploy to stall an investigation and start a, mental, not guilty by reason of insanity. But the prison had just recently shown the movie The Exorcist 3, where it featured a demon by the name of Gemini. Coincidence? I think not. Now, he wouldn't at this time admit to the Grissom family murders, but he did say to Bobby once the trial was over for the Gainesville murders, he would talk about it after that. This would be a lie, as he actually wouldn't admit anything until just before his execution. But just before the murder trial was actually due to begin, he would end up calling upon his public defender at the time, C. Richard Parker. He wanted to plead guilty. He said something along the lines of he didn't want to see the crime scene photos for the families to see them, though I truly do doubt this, to be honest, as it's been said that Danny's ultimate hero not only was his father, but Ted Bundy. Anyone who idolizes Ted Bundy, it doesn't seem like would have any empathy for the victims. Now, the public defender, he did attempt to persuade Danny not to do this. He'd actually tell them that it had a strong case to fight the death penalty at the very least. But if he pled guilty, he wouldn't be able to fight his conviction. It would only be his sentence that they'd be able to fight. It didn't move his decision at all. So 1 week before the trial, he signed a 3-page plea form and he would enter his guilty plea. Now, the public defender's only request would be that the plea not be announced until February 15th when the jury selection had begun. So the only person other than the judge that knew about the plea was the prosecutor. So you can imagine the shock for the families and I guess the relief, but yeah, I don't know. I really don't know. But with pleading guilty, the only requirement for the jury would be what sentence to impose. So according to Florida law, there were 11 possible aggravating circumstances, and at least one of these needed to be proved by the prosecution for the jury to determine that the death penalty was required. Now, opening arguments would begin on Tuesday, March 7th, 1994. Now, the prosecution would claim that they could be successful in proving 5 out of the 11 possible aggravating circumstances. So the crimes were cold-blooded and premeditated. The crimes were committed during sexual battery. The crimes were particularly heinous, atrocious, and cruel. The offender had prior history of felony convictions, and the crimes were committed for the purpose of escaping detection or avoiding arrests, particularly in the cases with Sonia and Manny. Yeah, it's, guys, I don't think it would have been a hard thing to prove any of those 5 things, right? Now, the defense would actually attempt to mitigate this and come back with the perpetrator suffered a mental illness at the time of the crimes. The crimes were committed under extreme stress. The perpetrator grew up in an abusive household. There was a history of drug and alcohol abuse, and the perpetrator showed remorse. Okay, so let's get to that. He suffered from a mental illness at the time of the crimes. I don't think he suffered from any type of mental illness, so I don't agree with that. They were committed under extreme stress. No, I don't. He took his time with each of his victims, so I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. Grew up in an abusive household? Absolutely. 100%. Absolutely. There was a history of drug and alcohol abuse? Again, yeah, 100%. He showed remorse. Look, everything that I've watched about Danny, it didn't seem to me that he had any real remorse, but I don't know. I mean, you're only seeing one side of the story in a lot of these documentaries, so it's really, really hard for me to judge that, right? Now, both sides, they'd end up having really compelling arguments. The prosecution would talk about the physical evidence, the screwdriver found at the campsite that matched all 3 murder sites, the confessions that he'd ultimately make to more than one cellmate were heard. But the defense would really try and use his childhood trauma, and his mum would end up actually talking at the trial to talk of the abuse that Danny in particular had endured. None of this swayed the jury at all, especially after seeing those horrific crime scene photos. And I ultimately don't think, if I was a juror myself, if I had seen the way he had posed those women and what he had done to Krista Hoyt in particular, I don't think I could have written that off as, oh, you had a mental illness, so therefore you don't deserve the death penalty. So at least for me, right? But the jury, they decided he should receive a death penalty on all 5 of those counts. Now, it was up next for a judge to review all of that evidence, and he had to make an independent judgment. He would take on the recommendation of what the jury had said, but he was to have his own independent investigation and think what had the prosecution and the defense presented. Now, Judge Morris, he would actually agree with the jury that their aggravating factors far outweighed the mitigating, and he would order Danny Rowling to be sentenced to death. Now, he would be sent to a state prison in Stark, where he'd be on death row until all of that appeal process was exhausted, and then he would be executed. Now, he would actually raise a number of appeals, but in particular, he would raise 6 claims of errors. Now, the trial court abused its discretion in denying his motion for a change of venue, and thereby violated his 6th Amendment right to be fairly tried by an impartial jury because of the persuasive and prejudicial pre-trial publicity that affected the Gainesville community, that he would be found to, the jury pool wouldn't have been fair. I don't think that's right. I think that I think it was the crime scene photos personally that swayed the jury. The trial court had an error in denying Rowling's motion to suppress his statements. So all those confessions, he didn't want them in the trial. He wanted to make it 3 separate sentence proceedings. So each of the murders, so Sonia and Christina's, 1 sentence hearing, and so forth. And I don't agree with that, but I don't know. He wanted a motion to suppress the physical evidence that was seized from his tent because of the warrantless search. Now, this is where the prosecutor or the state attorney or whoever the prosecutor was at the time, this is where they were smart. They did end up having a warrant. So whilst fruit from the poisonous tree could have been for before they had that warrant, once he had that warrant, sorry, mate, you're out. he would say that the homicide of Sonia Larson was not heinous, atrocious, or cruel. I don't know. Me personally, I just think some of this, I don't think it's right. And then he would say again that it gave an invalid and unconstitutional jury instruction on the heinous and atrocious and cruel aggravating circumstance. Mate, I think anyone can understand the word heinous, atrocious, or cruel. I think he was grasping at straws personally. Now, these appeals would be denied and he would be executed on October 25th in 2006. Now, before he died, he did give the Grissom family some form of closure. He would confess to the murders. During his 11th hour meeting with a spiritual advisor, he would actually end up revealing details in that particular murder that only the suspect could have known. Unfortunately, he was never, ever convicted of this. But the Reverend contacted prosecutors and told them of this particular incident where he would admit to the Shreveport murders. But yeah, he was in particular, a pastor from Shreveport actually was one of the 47 people to witness the execution. So it was really good that he was able to provide them with at least some closure. Danny's appeal attorney said he understood that his client had actually wanted to clear the name of another man who had been a suspect in the deaths of Julie Grissom, Sean Grissom, and her father. Now, a Shreveport police spokesperson would speak as well that the Louisiana authorities were trying to contact relatives of the Grissoms in case it ever came to light in a news conference. Announced all of this before they had an opportunity, I guess. It's just really sad. But the three family members who were found stabbed to death in Shreveport almost a year before the Gainesville crime spree, there were so similarities that it is hard to ignore, like what went down in there. But the Louisiana officers in particular have since said that Rowling is their only suspect in that case. It's just unfortunate, I think, that it was never, ever able to go to court and he be convicted of that crime because he really, really needed foreclosure for them, I think as well, at least for the Grissom family, that he be provided some type of closure. Now, I did allude to before where I spoke of that his mum and what all three women in particular, so Sonia in particular, and Christina and Krista all looked like his mum. So unfortunately, I think he was taking out the anger of her not protecting him when he was younger in regards to that. So unfortunately, those women died as a result of looking like her. Now, Kevin Williamson wanted to do a movie about college students getting murdered by a masked man. And in particular, he read a lot upon the Gainesville Ripper. And so the Gainesville Ripper actually inspired him to make the Scream movies. Now, in particular, guys, it ended up being about high school and all that kind of stuff. But he did inspire Kevin Williamson to make the Scream movies. Thank you all so much for joining again. If you could hit the subscribe button or the like button or the comments button, it would be awesome if you guys have any feedback for me. Always love to hear it. Anyway, Peanuts, I will speak to you again and see you in 2 weeks. Bye.